Welcome to the lecture on being prolific as a fiction writer. Everything that I will talk about in this lecture goes to being a fiction writer. Nonfiction writers have other issues and other things about being prolific that fiction writers don't, but everything here is about fiction writing. So let me go on from here and start off with, as I normally do, in these lectures, talking about the history a little bit of where this all comes from and where some of the myths around being prolific come from. In the last basically 150 years, there was quite a split back about 150 years ago, 140 years ago, in fiction writing. For the longest time, the only people who read fiction were, of course, the elite, the people who could read, and books were expensive. They were always done in leather and everything else. And if you find books from the 1800s in the leather form, they were quite expensive. Back in the pre-Civil War and so through the Civil War and after the Civil War, in that period of time, a different form of literature for the masses, started up. And it was entertainment, penny dreadfuls, the dime novels, all of that sort of stuff. And it basically kind of like electronic books today, they were different forms of delivery systems for fiction, for stories. And as this progressed up until about 1890, the people who were in a form thinking they were better than everybody else didn't much like the fact that these low-level people were starting to learn how to read. And at this point in American history, U.S. history, there was an attempt to really build a class structure, very much like the British class structure. In fact, that's where it came from. And this class structure was completely destroyed by the Titanic going down. It was pretty well toasted at that point in time. But in the late 1800s and into the early 1900s, the class structure was developing. And these people who were rich and thought they were better than everybody else, as the case may be, needed to have their own form of literature. And so therefore there were a series of articles in the 1890s that split fiction. It just split it. It split it into the readers who could read and would buy the cheaper stuff, which was the start of the pulp era at that point in time, the early days of the pulp era. And it went to the people who would read books, the big, thick leather books. And these series of articles were about how there was good literature versus other literature. Well, through the pulp era, up until about 1950, which is 50, 60 years in there, this split continued until after World War II, where the paperbacks became prevalent because the GIs and everything were reading, and everybody was reading, and the GI Bill got everybody going to school, and everybody was reading, and the split continued. But what happened in the pulps were there were a lot of writers who could just put out a lot of words on manual typewriters, and they were the most popular writers of their time. The Lester Dents and people like that, Max Brand, which was a pen name. And it just went on and on and on, where that split again. And so there was still the literature, which was being taught by the university programs. What's funny is that some of the most prolific and popular writers and fastest writers of their time were being taught as if they were, in programs that would tell people to slow down and not write fast. And that's still going on today. Of course, Dickens is a prime example of that one. And all the way through, and Hemingway, another prime example of a person who could write a single draft very quickly, spent all the rest of his time hunting and doing other stuff, was a reporter. And so they're now being taught as literature by people who tell people to slow down. Oh, you should write slow. So I'll talk about the myth of all of this here in a minute. But this history of being prolific is a thing where myths have developed around it because of the university systems and all of this fight between the people who thought that because they were a class, they should be the only ones reading, or they should be reading the good books. and everybody else would read that pulp trash. And of course, it was the pulp trash that was being made into the movies and everything else, and the good books are mostly forgotten. And so it's a matter of time that this has gone on. Now here we are in 2013, 2014, and this class structure is still in a battle system. It's because the university programs continue this battle system, and they continue to train us as we come up. Now there are reasons for this. There are reasons that teachers tell us to slow down when we're writing. Number one, when you've got a class of 40 or 50 people, you can't have 40 or 50 people writing continuously a short story every 2 days or something like that, and then you've got 6 classes as an instructor. You can't grade them. You can't read them. It's physically impossible for one instructor to actually run the program of how you actually should be a creative writer. So creative writing programs teach creative writing instructors. That's flat given. They don't teach people how to be creative people. They teach them how to teach. Perfectly valid. I got nothing wrong with that. I got zero problem with that. But this lecture is for people who want to be a creative writer. And there are aspects about that creativeness that you must throw away some of these myths you've learned in school to get to it before you can become a professional fiction writer. And that's what this lecture, I hope, will teach you how to be prolific as a professional fiction writer. So, now, before I move on to talking about the myths a little bit more, what's prolific? What is prolific? Tell you what, let me come back and spend an entire 6 or 7 minutes on what is prolific.